Distortion is a great tool to destroy sounds and push synth and percussion into completely different territory. Especially coming from guitar pedals, it's also easily mistaken for a set and forget effect. However, with a modular you have a lot more options to look for and find subtle uses and sweet spots. In this video I go over 3 different ways to use distortion to enhance a modular voice with subtle texture, grit and variations rather than adding a thick layer of destruction. For this, I'm using the Plasma Drive, a collaboration between Game Changer Audio and ericasynths. Almost all of the patches in this video can be made with any distortion that has a CV input for the dry-wet mix and the CV input for drive or gain. But I'm not going to lie, the Plasma Drive is kind of a thing on its own. The Plasma Tube adds a lot of sparkle, grit and texture to a sound even without any modulation, and that's exactly what triggered me to explore it. On top of that, the built-in EQ adds a valuable layer of sound shaping. And the tracking oscillators add additional modulation fun. Because I wanted to test if I could tame and use the effect of Plasma in my sounds, I got in touch with Game Changer and they sent me this unit. I did a similar video exploring the Plasma voice in case you're interested. But now, let's dive right in. A modular distortion doesn't have to be used as an end-of-chain effect. Modules can be patched at any point in an audio path, which opens it up for different and more subtle uses like adding texture and distortion directly to waveforms. Here, a single oscillator is sent through the distortion so it functions like a wave shaper. The Plasma Drive offers a lot of options to sculpt that wave. Of course, the CV inputs allow you to animate the waveform, for example by modulating the dry-wet mix with an LFO and the voltage CV with a smooth random voltage. I want to give some dry audio examples so you can hear the interesting texture and grit created by the module. But let's expand the setup with a simple low-pass filter and VCA, and add a sequencer and gated envelope modulating the filter to create a classic melodic voice. Here the distortion is still effectively used as a complex wave shaper, adding a lot of detail to the voice. Another interesting option is experimenting with single cycle wave modulation. For example, by using a copy of the main oscillator's output to modulate the dry-wet mix of the distortion. But you can push that further by using the oscillator to drive a clock divider or use sub-octave outputs to modulate the distortion with different but related frequencies. Adding a second oscillator to the setup is another interesting way to modulate the drive. This adds a nice layer of controlled secondary frequencies to the sound. In this setup, a square wave oscillator is used to modulate the CV. Here, the same concept is used in a more musical patch. The second oscillator is tuned and controlled with the same sequence as the main oscillator to maintain harmonic ratios. But a drifting effect is created by modulating the frequency of the second oscillator slightly with a sine wave LFO. The decay of the filter envelope is modulated with a bit of random voltage for some added dynamics. If you like to support my videos or you want to get access to PDF sheets with hundreds of patch ideas I used in my videos, have a look at my Patreon. Distortion is also a great tool to scope the development of a note. In my videos I talked a few times about transients, because the very short start of a sound has a big impact on its character. And similarly, what happens to the sound when it's sustained matters a lot. Aiming for a subtle controlled effect, the distortion is patched between the oscillator and filter. A melodic sequencer is used to tune the voice and trigger a softer envelope with a bit of attack. That envelope is modulating the filter and VCA through a mixer. To use the distortion to bring out that textured plasma crunch in the transient, the sequencer is triggering a second very sharp and plucky envelope. That envelope is used to modulate the dry-wet mix of the distortion so it's only audible on the transient. And to enhance that effect, a copy of that envelope is sent to the mixer so the plucky envelope is added to the mix, modulating the filter and VCA. The transient envelope has a bit of random decay modulation for added dynamics. The second envelope responsible for the transient doesn't need to be triggered in the same way as the main envelope. For example, you can have the sequencer's clock drive a pattern sequencer used to trigger the second envelope with an alternate pattern. The drive CV input is modulated with a random voltage to add extra sonic variation to dispatch. So far, I just showed sequence patches, but of course these ideas work with long sustained notes and or a keyboard as well. Here's the same voice controlled with the keyboard, gating an attack sustain release envelope, modulating the filter and VCA. Again, a very short plucky envelope is used for the transient. It's modulating the dry-wet mix of the drive as well as the filter and VCA. Because a keyboard can easily create longer notes, you can add more complexity in the development. Here, the transient envelope is sent through a mixer, so a third gated envelope with a very slow attack can be added, modulating the dry-wet mix. This envelope slowly brings the distortion back on long sustained notes. You can add extra depth to this setup by modulating the CV input as done before with things like a random voltage for sonic variations, but also with a copy of the envelope mix. This just subtly enhances the character of the drive. It's worth experimenting with the distortion in different places of the audio path. Here it's placed behind the filter but before the VCA. This can be too much for transient effects, but gives more space for the distortion's higher frequencies and crackles to shine. Here, a keyboard is used to gate an attack hole decay envelope, modulating the filter and VCA. And the delayed envelope is used to increase the dry-wet mix and voltage CV of the distortion on sustained notes. A smooth random voltage modulating the filter is added for some subtle fluctuations. Another interesting way to use a distortion is adding rhythmical variations to bars and loops. Even when using a distortion in a more classic end-of-chain setup, you can incorporate it into a patch deeper by adding tempo sync modulation or interaction between voices. Here, the distortion is used at the end of chain, which is often more interesting when it's processing more complex audio signals. In this patch, a sine wave oscillator with built-in wave folder through a low-pass filter is used. Both the wave folder and filter are modulated with a smooth random voltage to create a dynamic input signal. The filter modulation is set in such a way the audio almost disappears sometimes, which creates a nice input starving effect on the distortion. The sequencer's clock is driving a clock divider with multiple gate outputs. One gate is used on an envelope modulating the dry-wet mix, and another gate is used to modulate the CV input directly. This creates rhythmical variations of distortion. You can build on the complexity of the rhythmic modulation. Here, two more gate patterns are used to modulate the octave and sub-octave triggers of the plasma drive. And remember that in many cases, interesting rhythmic effects can be achieved by creating interaction with other parts. Here, the voice is sent through a VCA. Another division is triggering a kick as well as an inverted envelope. And that inverted envelope is docking the VCA for a classic sidechain effect. The octave and sub-octave triggers are a fun way to add variations to looping sequences as well. Here's a patch created in the first chapter with sequenced slow melodic voice. The oscillator is modulating the dry-wet mix, this time through a divide by 32 clock division, creating frequency-related fast LFO-like movement. The CV is modulated with a smooth random voltage. The clock output of the sequencer is driving a second divider, and two different divisions are used to modulate the octave and sub-octave triggers. This creates nice tempo synced variations. Here's the same setup but with faster 5-step sequence and a triggered plucky envelope with some shape modulation. In this case, modulating the octave and sub-octave triggers with slower clock divisions creates interesting shifting tonal variations to the sequence. If you like these kind of sounds, have a look at my video on the plasma voice. And as always, smash that like, subscribe and bell button if you want to see more modular content from me. But that's it for now, thanks for watching and see you next time.